Real quick, I just want to give a shout out to all my patrons over on Patreon, especially the big $10 patrons, LF Cruz, Neo Venus, and DefCat. Thank you so much for supporting me over there. If you'd like to support the channel, you can follow us over there, or you can get some of our really sick merch, like the Don't Feed the Fish shirt, Yuriko shirt, Najila shirt, or Corvold shirt, or the always popular Stacks the Anime shirt. That being said, let's get into the episode. Welcome to Learning cEDH, the podcast dedicated to teaching you everything you need to know about competitive Commander. I'm your host, Matthew, joined as always by my co-host, Eric. And today we're looking at episode 2 of our little mini series where we're talking about each of the sort of macro archetypes of cEDH. And today we're going to be talking about midrange.
Yeah, I love talking about going past turn 3. So that's how you know you're a midrange deck. So
as of this recording, I actually today just kind of released a video sort of complaining about midrange a bit, or the cards that are currently enabling it, I guess, because as you'll kind of come to find out, midrange is, at least right now, really powerful, especially the more into the type like the tournament EDH that you're playing. You're going to see that it, tends to outperform Turbo and Stacks pretty handily at getting like top 4 placements and wins. What are some of the main sort of like identifiers for midrange, you would say, Eric?
Timna Crom. No,
yeah.
I'm joking. But seriously, so some of the cards that you just, like you alluded to, are probably going to be your Mystic Lemora, your Ristic Study, Sylvan Library to a degree, your Commander Engines, Timna Crom, those type of things, Thrasios. I mean, it's pretty myriad. There's like a ton of things you can go on. There's even spectrums of mid-range that you want to look at. There's No, which is like Swiss Army knife of decks. Like, to me, it falls into essentially every category in some various form or another. You can make a case for it to fall in those categories. And that's just, when you look at mid-range, you're looking at a deck that's trying to basically not lose in the early turns, have some form of value engine set up, or something that's slowing the deck down, essentially with the value engine built into like the command zone. And then it just starts ultimately taking over the game with sheer amounts of card advantage and powerful spells. So, for example, we'll just make it really easy to me is something like Blue Farm, which is just going to be your Timna Crom variant. And it's just going to look for that kind of that Mystic Remora, that Ristic Study, Esper Sentinel as well. Also just getting like a Crom and Timna online and just drawing cards, accruing value, deploying resources, and protecting itself with counter spells, and it has removal spells, and it has the potential to just close out the game on any notice. So it does a really good job of not losing.
Yeah, there's definitely like sort of the main play patterns you can kind of expect for midrange is this development in the early game where, again, you're trying not to lose. So having something like a mental misstep in your opening hand is just, chef's kiss. That's perfect. And then you want to develop a bit of mana. You don't have to explode out like, some turbo decks are. You're not looking to necessarily play 3 to 5 mana rocks at turn 1, but you do want to get a little bit of acceleration. And then ideally one of those card draw engines like Eric was talking about to just start building your advantage, because that's really the name of the game, is getting set up, staying alive, and then building that advantage to you get to the point where other decks aren't going to be able to compete. Right now, like Eric was saying, Blue Farm is kind of the best at doing that. It has just the most natural card draw advantage in the format in the command zone, and it's in the colors that tend to do that the best right now. So that's the big one you're going to see. Another one you might see is a deck like Dawnwaker Thrasios, or just other Thrasios variants like Thrasios Timna. These decks are usually more dork heavy because that's kind of what you play green for in these mid-range shells. And you're going to see a lot of creature tutors because those are a lot of their value engines. Specifically, you're going to hear about Seedborn Muse with Thrasios, which is the kind of most absurd mid-range grindy engine you can get going.
It's the green ad nauseum, right?
Yep. The green slow nose, which is started to be quite hated in tournament EDH because of just the way it can really slow down the game. Especially you get 2 players doing it, it just becomes absurd where there's just so much value happening, and it gets to a point where it's really hard for other decks to compete. And that's kind of the name of the game, right? You have Timna decks that are trying to draw cards on their axis where they're more combat focused, Thrasios decks which are trying to develop ways to get a lot of mana advantage, and then you've got decks like Najila that kind of get to more recently pivot, I think, the best between a turbo style and a mid-range style, where they can just set down a Najila very early. You develop a lot of attackers to pressure life totals of the other ad nauseum decks, and then you can set a couple dorks and then get some card draw, or you can use cards like Infernal Plunge to power out something early. You always have the potential to just slam a Derevi and win. Having one card combos with your commander makes it really easy to pivot from the slow mid-range game plan right into that win the game turbo, slam it down, see if they have it style. And that's really indicative of what you see a lot of the successful mid-range decks, is that ability to go from the like slow draw go style into this explosion into a win.
You said it best. I think the best word is pivot. Mid-range decks have the best ability to pivot. There's more results, more interest in the format, and as the format grows, I think we've used the term, and you've talked about how you don't like the term rock paper scissors, which is kind of weird because it's a 4-player game, and I guess it's rock, paper, scissors, rocket ship, So I don't think those really exist in our game. But when we look at it, decks are becoming more evolved. The lists are becoming more fine-tuned to be able to have a broader spectrum. So in tournament play, at least, you're not seeing as much like Evish, like Ograk, like this hyper super explosive like Rakdos ad nauseum style deck. And those decks always have a place in the format. I think those kind of decks help keep their decks honest and run interaction and all that type of stuff, or like quote stacks pieces, but aren't inherently a stacks deck. I think that's what mid-range does better than anything. It really has the ability to kind of catch all spectrums of the flavor. If you look at it, for example, like we were talking about Timna Crom, it's not a stacks deck, but it actually has quite a bit of stacks, creatures in it and stacks effects, or just taxing effects in general. So we have obviously we've talked about Mystic Ristic and Esper Sentinel, but then we've got various flavors they're all pretty much on opposition agent. Grand Abolisher is a little bit different because that's more of a protection piece. Then you have, whether it's on Dauthi Voidwalker or Lavinia, Archivist of Ogma, again, not inherently a stacks piece, but a rewarding piece that helps accrue card advantage. Crom can almost kind of insulate you a little bit against that as well, because it's essentially trying to dissuade people from playing 2 spells a turn, or you'll draw a card. So these decks have all these kind of elements into it. Not to mention if they're running powerful ritual effects like Dark Ritual, and virtually every deck has access to fast mana. It's got access to all the mana crypts, the mana vaults, if they're on that, the Mox Diamonds, the Chrome Moxes, so Soul Ring, pretty ubiquitous card effects like that. And then we've got potential fast mana in lands like Ancient Tomb is pretty universal. Now City of Traders is becoming more and more adopted. You have the talisman effects that just help smooth out draws to increase that velocity, even though the cards aren't inherently moving faster, but your approach to the game might be. So that's what's beautiful about mid-range, is that it has the ability to do everything. So even the former turbo decks that were these ultra fast dedicated turbos, if you look at the evolution of them, they're virtually mid-range decks. They just have the potential to turbo, but they're kind of all hovering around this. If you look at it on a sliding scale, say mid-range is kind of considered. So turbo, to me, the more successful turbo decks have more mid-range elements to them. So you even take something we're talking about mid-range, but we're talking about Rog Silas. If you ask anybody, they're just going to say, oh, clear turbo deck. The turbo deck, but the newer builds of it also have the ability to play longer games with more wheels, necropotence, more interaction, Bolus of Citadel, if Brian Cook's variant. So Najeela, we've already discussed Najeela, same thing. So it's not just these ultra glass cannony decks. And then if you want to look at a stacks variant, well, really stacks is a mid-range deck. It's just another form of a mid-range. It may not be utilizing a bunch of blue cards to draw cards, but even take Urza. So Urza is a great example. It's a mid-range deck that's a control deck, but it's also a stacks list. So it has all these elements to it. So cEDH is really complicated. I think that's Magic in general. You look at how Magic's evolved over the years, you can't even, the old term control deck. So if you talk 10 years ago about control, maybe it's a little bit more now because I'm getting old, but maybe 15 years, control meant all go, blue, draw, go. Control does not mean that anymore. Control means a completely different element. So I think with the evolution of the game and the evolution of the way the cards and how cards all have these powerful effects, Dockside Extortion is a perfect example. So Dockside is a card that is, if you're playing red, you're going to be playing Dockside. It's a card that just helps power out your mid-range effects, but also inherently can turbo out your game. So it doesn't make your deck a turbo deck, but it just allows you to play your cards faster. You're still doing a mid-range grinding plan. So if I'm on, let's say, something like Thrasios Dargo, which has been kind of cropping up a little bit more lately since its success, I think it had a little bit. It's got this Dargo, which incentivizes the storm element. And storm doesn't inherently mean like turbo. Storm just means like a manual storm term. So a great example of something like that would be like Kark Sakashima. It's a mid-range deck that's also a storm deck. So it has that fast plan. It has this mid-range plan. It has all the control elements to play because it's blue, play into those type of games. So mid-range is like this really unique fact that now is kind of like encompassing. So it's really like maybe you're on Dark Ritual, Cabal Ritual, but you might not be on like Infernal Plunge, Rite of Flame. You know, even you look at the mid-range decks, like a lot of the Tim to Crom variants play like Rite of Flame just because it's just gets you a little bit faster by still just deploying your effects to draw the game out and draw more cards. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think in what it kind of points to is in general, the effects that sort of, they don't necessarily punish other players. Like you're talking about with like Ristics and Mystics, these cards that they gain you some advantage through people doing the opposite of what you want them to do. You, as if you're a blue farm player, you kind of don't want anybody to do anything. And so if you can say, hey, don't do anything, or I'm going to draw a bunch of cards, which is the other thing you want to do, you have so many pieces now. Or if it's drawing cards, or maybe it's opposition agent where it's just like, hey, if you're going to tutor, no, you're not. Actually, I'm going to tutor. Or with Archivist of Magma, if you're going to tutor, I'm going to draw. It's just, we've seen people sort of realize that like, hey, punishing game actions is kind of one of the best things you can do when they reward you instead of just saying, hey, you can't do this, which is why like we're not seeing like Rule of Law and Deafening Silence get splashed the way that Ristic Study and Esper Sentinel can get splashed in pretty much any decks that have those colors, because it's just right now so inherently powerful. You just say like, hey, 75% of game actions, they're not mine. If I can get advantage on, even half of those, then you're going to get this massive increase in the value that you generate over the course of the game. So there's definitely like a push for a lot of decks to sort of take that same strength because, those cards are there, they're really powerful, and, it's challenging a bit of deck building preconceptions for some lists that are moving more mid-rangey or trying to combat it. But currently it's doing very well. It's making stacks, kind of non-Monota stacks specifically, is kind of struggling to compete because that also plays into that same game plan, right? Like if you're a Timna Crom player just chilling out with a Timna and a couple of attackers, if nobody on the table is drawing any or casting any spells, that really heavily advantages you because you're over there drawing 4 cards a turn, casting whatever your best spell is, and then holding up interaction to interact, with players' 1 other cards. So there's a lot of different factors have led to mid-range being just this really strong powerhouse that it is. But I would say that it's not all, I guess, doom and gloom, and that there's just, 4 or 5 color piles. There are some variants of mid-range that also can sort of like move between sort of that fast and slower pace. So something like a Kinnan deck, for instance, can really, that's, the best mana dork deck out there. You get to double up on all of those that can have you move incredibly quickly through the game. And just sometimes you have the Basalt Monolith into the Mirage Mirror and you just win. But it's also a deck that can just say like, it can sort of do the Thrasios thing where it can just be activating Kinnan to get some value out, or draw off its Ristics and Mystic Remoras and things like that. And then you also have a lot of Esper decks that have recently cropped up. Decks like Tivit that have done really well recently that sort of have like their massive value engine in the command zone that's just this ridiculous hard to kill Titan. And it's just doing the sort of Esper, sort of blue farm light thing, but you don't have the speed of red, but you have compact sort of 1-card combos with Time Sieve that you have access to. And then you have the Oracle Consult, which is another really common thing you're going to see across a lot of these decks.
Yeah, so when you look at like Esper mid-range, for example, like Tivit's really popped up, but like Timna Malcolm, which recently won not too long ago, the deck has exactly what you need. It has Anna in the command zone in the form of Malcolm. It has Timna, obviously, which is, going to draw you cards. Obviously, your other commander flies, which really helps out. And then you also get to play like all the good stuff. You get to play, to me, the big 3 and Mystic and Esper Sentinel. Then you get like Archivist Vogma, you get Opposition Agent, you get Douthie Woodwalker, Ranger Captain to a certain degree. That deck also gets to play cards like Graph Digger's Cage, which is pretty insane, because that card's really powerful in our format. So this deck has a lot of stacks elements, but it's not a stacks deck. It's a mid-range deck. It's a deck that is controlling a narrative of a game. Also potentially just can win the game pretty early with a protected Thoracle line. It just happens to have it. It has the Dark Rituals. It has the Ad Nauseam. It has the ability to protect like an end turn Ad Naus, So things like that, like decks like that are really, really good that don't necessarily inherently need red. It does miss out on having like Dockside Extortionist, but if you could have all those colors with Dockside, with Underworld Breach, but also have access to mana in the command zone, and that's pretty unique. That shows you the power level of something like Malcolm in a mid-range list. It's not playing, Glinthorn Buccaneer, that it's still that good of a card.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways that you can utilize something like that. Is, for example, like a lot, you might think of Malcolm as like a combo piece commander, but getting a treasure return sometimes, it's not really that bad. I think the deck runs a few different pirates as well to kind of get some other treasure triggers. And, you have, I think, cards like Siren Stormcaller that kind of synergize and lets you do like, you also just get Timna attackers. They synergize, having a flyer in the zone that makes you treasures. It all just kind of layers over it.
They can place Changeling Outcast,
Okay, yeah.
cEDH All-Star Staple.
Yeah, it pops up. And another pretty different sort of mid-range deck, Yuriko, which is
that's a great example.
A really cool one, a great one I would recommend to new players. If you're coming from casual commander, you're probably already familiar with Yuriko and you might hate her because she's pretty crazy over there. You kind of get to do that same thing with her because she's just another really ridiculous value engine in the command zone for 2 mana. You're almost never going to pay more than 2 for her. Doesn't matter how much she gets killed. Doesn't matter if there's a Drannith Magistrate. She's still coming back. And you just get to do these she does this thing where instead of getting to play these high value, high impact cards like, Ragavan or a lot of the white cards like Esper and stuff, you just turn your attackers into their own value engines through Yuriko. And it also gets to become a reliable win condition because you just get to do so much damage with her. That's another really interesting one, and colors that you don't typically see as just like a mid-range deck. You're missing the white, you're missing the green. The power of having that card draw in the command zone, especially if it comes down cheap and you have other synergistic things you get to do with it. It's just, it's a reliable recipe for a strong deck that has a chance to just sit there, hold up interaction. You're drawing a ton of cards. That helps you get to the next turns where you have more cards than everybody else. You get to keep interacting, and then you get to yourself to a position where you get to win.
I think another hallmark thing about mid-range decks is I think they mulligan better than all the other decks in the format.
Yeah.
Like a turbo deck, if you don't happen to have like a tutor that lines up with what you're doing, your deck's going to really struggle. And again, when I look at like pure turbo decks, I feel like there's less and less of them. I think there's decks that have turbo elements.
Mm-hmm.
The true, like, just I'm trying to dump everything out as fast. Like, I don't see a Cole deck. Like, like Cody, you might see a Cody pop up, but even then, if you really look
if you checked out my stream last week, as of this recording, at least you could have seen some Cole action with Jake Fitzsimons. He loves that deck. But anyways,
but like if you look at like you like again, Cody is under the moniker of Turbo Ad Nauseam decks, but Cody has a lot of interaction.
Mm.
So while it might be that's what it's trying to do, it still has like a tremendous amount of bounce spells and interaction pieces, removal, because it's obviously going to have this kind of crutch of the way Cody plays. Like it needs to also remove its own self, potentially. Obviously, it needs to remove its Cody.
Mm.
But at the same time, like it still can fall. It's not trying to be a mid-range deck, but it still has a lot of the same elements as these decks do. It's just really interesting to see how these decks go because mulligan really matters in our format. Like Magic in general, I think if people learn to mulligan better, whether you're casual or competitive, I think it just helps your skill set and the quality of the game overall for yourself and your pod members as well. But you want to be a factor in the game. You don't want to just be the person that like is a land, passes with no interaction or no potential to stop somebody. And then you just kind of sit there and you're a non-factor. Sometimes it just ends up that way because you mulligan like really, really heavily and you just don't see the cards. But I think that a great hallmark point of midrange is that it has all these potential cards in it. So whether it's the Mystic Ristic, Esper Sentinel, some other form of value engine, and the ability to just smooth out its draws with its commanders, I think that's what makes midrange so effective in our format. If you take like a stacks deck and then mulligan and your stacks pieces don't line up, you're out of the game. Like, you have to actively look for, if you're green, you're looking for like a collector oof or a null rod or something like that. And, you don't, and maybe, have card advantage in the command zone unless you're on like, Timna Kamal, or something like that, which, I haven't seen that deck in a while. But like Yusharn. Yusharn doesn't have card advantage in the command zone. I mean, kind of
Mhm.
Yusharn kind of does, but it's like one of those cards where you actively have to look for these pieces and they all have to line up appropriately based on the texture of the game and the pod. And it's just, mid-range kind of gets to do the best of everything. And that's what's really beautiful about it. It mulligans really well. It has really good commanders. It's whether it's a 3-color or a 4-color to 5-color pile. It has a specific game plan. It also is very effective at winning the game as well. That's another thing too. Like they typically have a clean A plus B or A plus B with a small C involved, like if it's like Unroll Breach. So that's something that's really mid-range so appealing to a lot of people is that you're also not pressured to make a play. You get a really great turbo aficionado who's like inherently really good with their deck. I really trust that player. So great example would be like someone like Z-Rob with Rogsai. Like that person clearly puts up results with that deck and they know their way with that deck. So, but not everybody has that ability because your margin for error is much less. And mid-range, it's just not like slam opposition agent into play. It just, it just kind of does its thing. And that's not trying to say like it has no bad play patterns or anything like that, because that's not what I'm trying to say. That's about any Magic card, but your margin of error on those cards is just so much less. It's just like if you went back to the old school 60 card formats, aggro was really known for years as kind of the quote dumb person's like deck, which is really kind of the opposite because your margin for error is so much less. You know exactly how much to commit, how much to not commit, because no matter what, Wrath of God 4 mana wipes the board. Whether it's 1 or 10 creatures. So when you have the ability to like effectively shut down somebody else's play for 2 mana and basically stop what they're doing, that's a really powerful play. But whether or not you need a lightning bolt creature or lightning bolt the person and try to rely on top decks or apply pressure, it takes a lot of skill. And sometimes it just gets there, but our format really doesn't have those type of decks. Sometimes decks just win because cards don't line up very well. Nobody has any interaction. Somebody plays a silence, casts ad nauseum, wins the game, or Thassa's Oracle combo, something like that. But we don't have that, every critical little decision ever matters or you're super punished because no matter what, you have 3 other people in the pod. So you're already thinking like that anyways. So mid-range is such a unique style because it just kind of gets to do everything. I just think that's why it's so powerful. It's appealing and allows people to also play more Magic as well.
You're talking about how it mulligans really well, and I think a lot of that is the context that you get to look at your hands in because you have such a good way to pivot and just inherently, assuming games even play out like an average way, right? Then you're expecting to see maybe like 5 to 10 more cards than your opponents who don't have a value engine in the command zone, like a Rogsai, for example. They might run a lot of the same cards as a blue farm deck, but when they're looking at like a card like Mental Misstep in their opening hand, that's, their maybe one piece of protection that they'll have for when they try to go for it on turn 2 or turn 3. Whereas a blue farm player can look at that card and just say, okay, well, this can be my way to stop, the first Esper Sentinel or Mystic Remora that happens, or I get to stop Rogsai's Tutor, or maybe in 5 turns, things go my way and I get to use it to counter a Swan Song that's targeting my Adnos. So you get to really just focus on flexibility in your slots. And that's where like you'll hear a lot of people talk about just like card quality comes into play, where it's just like, how good is this card in the average setting, and how many different scenarios is it good in? And that's where the more cards we get that are good in a wide variety of scenarios, that's where you see mid-range decks just become more and more powerful because they just get to run the best stuff typically in either 4 colors or all 5.
Something else too that mid-range gets to really do, if it gets stopped, it has the ability to recuperate pretty well too. Because again, as we've mentioned, various commanders, whether that's the Timna, Crom, Thrasios, I'm sure I'm missing. There's a ton of commanders like that, even Tivit, for example. So all these type of commanders, Winona, same thing. It just has the ability to just kind of rebuild itself out of thin air to some degree. But that's another thing too. It's like, oh, I try to go for my ad nauseam with my instep, oh well, didn't go through, basically got to take like no time off during my main phase. I get to untap, and if I still have, these creatures like, Timna, Crom, Douthie Voidwalker, your Captain of Eos, all these type of cards that just happen to either get me another card or prevent somebody else from doing something to Lavinia, you're still pretty much in control of what you're doing, and then you just get to attack people and draw cards. So, you get to just refuel back up. And basically you do a really great job at not losing. And then when you get to present your win with like a protected like Grand Abolisher or something like that. That's something that deck does really, really well. And so look at these mid-range decks, like they all have a unique way of like winning the game. And I don't mean like y'all know like Dimir decks or Thassa's Oracle combo or like some form of like maybe Brain Freeze with Underworld Breach, that type of stuff with also Thoracle, But like Karark Sakashima like it works on a completely different axis as like that deck, but it still is a mid-range deck in that regard. And the reason why I call it a mid-range deck is like I honestly haven't played. I've played a lot against it, but like someone like Ken, who's like very well known for that list and the Karark Godfather per se, but they dubbed it as a mid-range deck. And then when you look at it, that's what it really does. Now it has the ability to like do some crazy stuff, especially if Karark's rocking and rolling. But if the deck just does its thing, it's like put a Karark out, put a Sakashima out, and then it's just got its value pieces on. It can do the thing. It can do the Mystic and the Esper or the Ristic Study per se. Doesn't have Esper Sentinel, thank God. But it can do the thing, and then again, it's got all the blue interaction, and then it just has that type of plan. So it's really just interesting how there's other decks, and we're just naming kind of the hot take decks that are out there that most people would kind of know about. There's a ton of other decks out there. Don't think of us as like these are the only decks you could ever play, because that's not the case. We're just thinking of like what are some kind of just, if you were to look at a tournament result right now, what would you kind of see in the top 4? You would see some form of like Malcolm deck, some form of Grindy variant, some Kroms, those type of things, the Gila, those type of cards.
Yeah, you definitely have a lot of other ones, especially in like as you get lower color, they tend to be greener, I guess, for the most part, because green kind of lets you just kind of like develop, dorks in the early turns. It tends to mulligan pretty well. And you have like green, blue, if you're doing like the Simic nonsense kind of game plan, it can work pretty well. Listening to us here, it may sound like mid-range has literally no weaknesses and you should just always be playing it no matter what. There are a couple downsides to playing mid-range. So especially for a new player, I would say a lot of the higher color mid-range piles or good stuff decks, they have the ability to pivot, but they also, to play optimally, they kind of have the requirement to pivot. So if you're not able to, see your opening hand, recognize that it's strong for whatever X amount of turns, and then at some point you're going to need to tutor for a certain piece in order to, really close the door on the turbo decks or make sure that you have enough going on. The Thrasios, like the creature heavy decks specifically, have a lot of tutoring, especially if the Sands blacklist, because a lot of times you might have to do something like mystical tutor for a worldly tutor to get a creature, or you might have to use something like a neoform into a spellseeker to go get a counterspell because you don't have access to those black tutors. So you have to get really creative with your list. These decks really reward you for knowing your deck, understanding all the lines, especially as you get to those, like I said, creature heavier decks that they may have compact lines, but also they'll usually have like different options that you can pivot into. Thrasios decks specifically, they have like, you've got Devoted Druid stuff going on, you've got Kinnan stuff going on, you got Zerda, and you got all kinds of nonsense, Emil Dockside. And so understanding what the deck specifically that you're playing, what tools it has access to, when those tools are at their best, what spells you need to interact with. Because as much as we say like, you can sit back and draw go, you are going to have to interact at some point. And that is, you have plenty of opportunities to mess that up. If you're not, really diligent with the amount of interaction you have, you might have the most cards in hand, but if you counter, player 1 and 2 and then player 3, you don't have any answers to, they got you. It's going to happen sometimes. If you're going to need to get a read on the table and understand like, hey, this is my game plan. How do I optimize it? And that is less focused, I would say, in mid-range than it can be in turbo decks, like we said, where, turbo decks are kind of dedicated to going and doing their thing. So they might have, an advanced decision tree because they have a small margin of error, but they're also typically focused on a small number of turns, right? You could make a mistake with a mid-range deck on turn 2 that bites you on turn 8. And so it's one of the key things, especially for newer pilots and in the higher color mid-range decks like Blue Farm and any of your Thrasios variants like Dawnwaker, something to watch out for and keep in mind if you try to start the game with a deck like that.
Yeah, so that's really a great point there on that. And also, too, just, I don't know if I apologize if I missed it, but just the ability to fetch, understanding your fetching decisions and knowing, like, do I need Volcanic Island, Tropical Island? When you look at like some of these decks, I'll give you, to me, one of the typical what weaknesses of something like Blue Farm is like it's a Grixis deck that splashes white. The whites are double white, like Ranger Captain and Grand Abolisher. So you look at something like that, and especially too, if you're like trying to play like a first turn Esper Sentinel, you may not use white for a while for the rest of the game. You might have something that you play, of course. You got Tymna, of course. And that's the thing. Like Tymna is actually one of the hardest things to cast in the list, despite how good and having access to all these lands are. Because when you look at your fetches, like, you have to sometimes make concessions on what lands you play. You don't get to run like 4 City of Brasses or 4 Mana Confluences. You have to run City of Brass, Mana Confluence, Exotic Orchard, and then now you're just kind of like, unless it's turn 0, Gemstone Caverns is pretty dead. It's just colorless, so it's not something that you enjoy. Ancient Tomb really doesn't help you accelerate, or rather accelerate, but help your color pie. So you're looking at things like your fetches really, really matter. And then you got to make concessions like, okay, am I on Tarnished Citadel? Am I on Spire of Industry? Exotic Orchard. Oh, darn, I went first. The Exotic Orchard doesn't do anything, And so it's not just, you don't get to just, have your cake and eat it too in these 4-color decks. And it's something that I've noticed, and I know some decks do a really great job with it because they might have access to green. But like, I think typically 3-color decks have better mana and 5-color decks have better mana. There's like this weird tension in this 4-color decks. Now, green 4-color decks, I think get away with it a little bit better because they have like dorks, like Birds of Paradise. If they're on like something like the Pod, Ignoble Hierarch, Birds of Paradise, they have a little bit better access to stuff like that. But then Nagila can just play just the best green dorks and then also have the mana. And so it's a little bit smoother for them. But something just to keep in mind when you look at your deck and building your deck, of knowing like what pips and that type of stuff. That's why you don't see like whether the card fits the deck archetype or not. That's why you don't see like Necropotence really in like Blue Farm anymore, because it's really hard to cast. Same with something like Peer into the Abyss. Whether that card resolves or not, it's still really hard to cast because of the triple black. So now you have triple black. You already have double black and ad nauseum. You got your blue cards. That's why whether how good or not 2-mana counter spells are, like something like Mana Drain, it's double blue. Even the decks that can cast it, it's not always effective. Like some like Kennen, a little bit different, but like these 3-color decks really have to question like, do I want this card? And that's why you might, want to have a better process on your mana. Your mana really matters in these decks. So just kind of keep that in mind. That gets into the weeds a little bit of mid-range decks, but that's just, you want to think about everything that comes into mid-range. You don't want to just go, oh, it's just this perfect scenario, because if that was the case, every mid-range deck would win and you'd have 4 winners and no losers. And that's not how cEDH works.
Yeah, so there are, concessions that you'll make for mid-range. Generally, though, every deck can cEDH to some extent, especially if you're new. It's gonna be hard. There's gonna be a learning curve. Don't let it scare you away that you might have to tutor more. If you look at a deck like Dawnwake or Thrasios, you think it's really cool, hop in there, try it out. There's a lot of content on it. That's another thing about these really popular high color decks, is that it's usually easy to find information about them or find content covering them, or somebody you can chat with that has experience. Especially if you like Blue Farm, man, you have got it so easy, because you can watch every tournament from now on. You can watch every Playing with the Power video, and you're going to see Blue Farm show up in a lot of instances. Yeah, a lot of these staples of the format, it's a bit easier to help that learning curve, even though in some instances they might have a steeper one where, there's a bit to learn with the tutoring and the pivoting.
Blue Farm is Blue Farm. This actually whole episode is just actually Blue Farm. That is mid range, but especially with the evolution of something like Blue Farm, where Blue Farm originally was like this 4-color turbo ad nauseum deck. In reality, it's more so this grindy mid range deck that can sometimes turbo out a win, but in reality, you're just trying not to lose in the early games, deploy your threats, get resources, and threats as in cards like Mystic Ristic, those type of cards, Opposition Agent, just to really like slow down the game and also just take advantage of sniping a tutor or something like that, or preventing your opponents from tutoring, really. But that's one thing that, and it's really kind of hard because like mid-range decks and like their formats don't really equate to what mid-range is in cEDH. You look at mid-range and like, I haven't played Standard in a while, but like previously, there was like the last Standard I was a part of. There's a lot of like Simic X nonsense going on, like the Sultai Ultimatum list. I think it's called like Emergence Ultimatum, that basically just lets you like a bunch of stuff for free. Then there was just like, the Omnaths of the world, those type of cards. cEDH is quite a bit different than those type of decks that are just basically trying to play like some like derpy slow card every turn. The cards in this format, while we use the term mid-range, is still hyper efficient. Like, Don't get me wrong, like every deck has access to fast mana. So you might think of like Rhystic Study as for more so for like the newer players coming in, but I see Rhystic Study as like this card you play on turn 3. No, it's typically coming out in like 1 and 2. The game is like slowing down, but it's more hyper efficient in that regard. So don't think of it as like Midrange is like this turtle deck that, you know, if for all my fighters, people who love fighting games, like a turtle character, these decks are still really fast and in terms of able to deploy these more powerful effects, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's important to keep in mind. So, like, again, if you're coming from a typical card game or other Magic format, like 60 card format, where mid-range is a lot more about just like curving out into, you know, you start off with like a dork into, you know, your good 2-drop into your good 3-drop, and you just kind of keep the game going your way. But I think the main thing to keep in mind is that in a lot of formats, combo is considered an archetype, whereas in cEDH, it's just kind of the default. And so when every deck, you know, is a combo deck, that means every deck has to some extent be highly interactive or disruptive. And so there's not as much of that, because a lot of times mid-range decks are going to develop a little bit of their mana and spend a little bit of it, but you're not really looking to curve out as well, because if you don't have, you know, all your free interaction in your hand, when you tap out with a deck, you know, here, if you're trying to go slower, you put yourself at risk of just dying to that turbo deck with a turn 2 Nos because everybody's tapped out. So the differences between the formats really kind of highlights the differences with the archetype. It's why we didn't have a video on aggro. We talked about turbo, which is not really typically a macro archetype in, you know, regular Magic 60 card formats. But yeah, hopefully this has helped you sort of understand a bit of the mid-range craze, and we'll help you on your way to being a esteemed blue farm pilot, probably.
Or just like Grixis mid piles. Those are great too. So
yeah, lots of mid-range ad nauseum stuff right now. But yeah, hopefully you found this video helpful, or this podcast rather helpful. Next time, we're going to be taking a look at the last macro archetype of stacks. We're going to get to talk about Winota, and then I guess there's other decks too. But
there's supposedly other decks in this archetype, so we'll cover those.
Yeah, we'll see when we get to that. But yeah, this has been Learning cEDH. Make sure to, if you enjoyed this, let us know in the comments. Let us know what we can do to improve. Like us, follow us over on Spotify or wherever you listen. Subscribe over on YouTube so you can get all the latest updates and the other videos I do for educational cEDH content. And yeah, this has been Learning cEDH. Go play cEDH.